The telegram arrived on the same morning. Florence Ramsey discovered that loving someone with your whole heart meant nothing when your bank account ran dry. She stood in the parlor of her father's grand house in Philadelphia, holding the crisp paper that confirmed what the lawyers had been whispering for weeks. The Ramsey fortune, built on shipping and trade, had collapsed like a house of cards when 3 vessels sank in a storm off the Carolina coast. Insurance companies refused to pay, creditors circled like vultures, and everything her family owned would be auctioned within the month to satisfy debts. Her father had died of a heart attack 2 weeks earlier, likely from the stress of watching his empire crumble. Her mother had passed years before from consumption. At 23 years old, Florence was alone, and she was penniless. She heard footsteps on the marble floor and turned to see Charles walking toward her, his perfectly tailored suit catching the morning light streaming through the tall windows. Her fiancé of 8 months, the man who had promised to love her in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, though they had not yet spoken their vows. His handsome face wore an expression she had never seen before, something cold and calculating that made her stomach twist. "Florence, we need to talk," he said, not meeting her eyes. She already knew what was coming. She had seen it in the way his visits had become shorter over the past week, the way his kisses had grown perfunctory, the way his mother had stopped including her in plans for the wedding that was supposed to take place in 3 months. "You are leaving," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Be reasonable," Charles said, spreading his hands as if this were a simple business matter. "My family has expectations. I have responsibilities. I cannot marry a woman with no prospects, no dowry, no connections. You must understand that this is not personal." Florence felt something crack inside her chest, but she refused to let him see her cry. "Not personal. We were going to build a life together, Charles. You said you loved me." "I did love you," he said, and had the audacity to sound regretful. "But love does not pay bills or maintain social standing. My mother would disown me. My father would cut me off. I am sorry, Florence, but I have to think of my future." "I hope your future keeps you warm at night," Florence said, turning away from him. "Please leave." She heard him hesitate for just a moment before his footsteps retreated across the marble, and the front door closed with a final click. Only then did she allow herself to sink into her father's leather chair and let the tears come. They were not tears of sadness for losing Charles, she realized, but tears of rage at her own blindness. She had thought he loved her, but he had only loved her father's money and the doors it opened. Now that those doors were closing, he had scrambled through them before they could trap him on the wrong side. The auction happened on a gray Tuesday morning. Florence watched strangers paw through her mother's china, her father's books, the furniture she had grown up with. She kept only what she could fit in 2 trunks, practical clothes, a few photographs, her mother's wedding ring, and a small amount of jewelry the lawyers had allowed her to retain. When it was over, she had $300 to her name and nowhere to go. That evening, she sat in a boarding house room that smelled of boiled cabbage and studied a map of the United States. Philadelphia held nothing for her now but memories and shame. Her father's sister, Aunt Margaret, had written months ago from Arizona Territory, begging Florence's father to invest in her husband's general store in a town called Springerville. Her father had refused, calling it a foolish venture in an uncivilized place. But Aunt Margaret had mentioned in that letter that they always needed help at the store, that the town was growing, that opportunities existed for those willing to work hard. Florence traced the distance with her finger. It might as well have been the moon. But what choice did she have? She could stay in Philadelphia and watch her former friends pretend not to see her on the street, could take a position as a governess or seamstress, always wondering if Charles was laughing about her somewhere. Or she could go west, where no one knew her story, where she could reinvent herself, where hard work might mean something more than her last name. She bought a train ticket the next morning. The journey took 6 days of rattling rails, changing trains, and sleeping sitting up because she could not afford a sleeping car. Florence watched the country transform outside her window. Cities giving way to farmland, farmland giving way to plains, plains giving way to desert. By the time she reached the rail station in Holbrook, her dress was rumpled, her hair had come loose from its pins, and she felt like she had been shaken in a jar. From Holbrook, she would have to take a stage to Springerville, another day's journey south. The stage was crowded with a mix of rough-looking men who smelled of whiskey and tobacco, a thin woman with 2 crying children, and a drummer trying to sell patent medicine. Florence squeezed herself into a corner and tried to make herself invisible. The road was little more than a rutted track through high desert country, dotted with juniper trees and red rock formations that looked like they had been carved by a giant's hand. Mountains rose in the distance, purple against the blue sky. They stopped to change horses at a way station where the April sun beat down with unexpected intensity. Florence stepped out to stretch her legs and accepted a dipper of water from the station keeper. The air smelled different here, sharp and clean, with hints of pine and dust. Despite everything, she felt something stir in her chest. Hope, maybe, or just the relief of being somewhere Charles and his kind would never venture. "Stage leaving in 5 minutes," the driver called. Florence turned back toward the coach and nearly collided with a man leading 2 horses. She stumbled and his hand shot out to steady her, rough fingers gentle on her elbow. "Pardon me, miss," he said, his voice a low drawl. "Did not see you there." She looked up and up because he was tall, well over 6 feet. He wore dusty work clothes, a worn hat pushed back to reveal sun-darkened skin and dark hair that needed cutting. But it was his eyes that caught her, gray as a winter sky, framed by smile lines that suggested he laughed often. He was perhaps 25 or 26, with the lean, muscular build of someone who worked hard for a living. "My fault," Florence said, suddenly aware of how bedraggled she must look. "I was not watching where I was going." He smiled, and it transformed his face from handsome to something that made her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with her recent heartbreak. "You heading to Springerville?" "Yes, my aunt lives there. Margaret and Thomas Whitfield. Do you know them?" "Sure do. Tom runs the general store on Main Street. Good people." He studied her for a moment, and she had the strange sensation that he saw past the wrinkled dress and tangled hair to something deeper. "I am Garrett Zimmerman. I have a ranch about 10 miles outside town. Welcome to Arizona territory, miss." "Ramsey. Florence Ramsey. Pleasure to meet you, Miss Ramsey." He touched the brim of his hat and led his horses toward the water trough. Florence climbed back into the stage, but she found herself thinking about gray eyes and a gentle smile instead of the landscape rolling past. She scolded herself. The last thing she needed was to be foolish over another man, especially some cowboy she would probably never see again. Springerville turned out to be smaller than she had expected. A single main street lined with wooden buildings, a few cross streets with houses and more businesses, and mountains rising on all sides like protective walls. The stage stopped in front of a hotel, and Florence climbed down with her 2 trunks, looking around for Aunt Margaret. She had sent a telegram from Philadelphia, but she was 3 days earlier than she had indicated, having found a faster connection in St. Louis. No one was waiting for her. Florence paid a boy a nickel to watch her trunks and walked down the street until she found Whitfield's General Store painted in neat letters above a door. A bell jangled as she entered. The store was bigger than it looked from outside, crammed with everything from flour sacks to saddles, lanterns to bolts of cloth. Behind the counter stood a round-faced woman with graying hair pinned in a practical bun. "Aunt Margaret," Florence said. The woman looked up, and her face went through several expressions in quick succession: confusion, recognition, shock, and then joy. "Florence! Dear Lord, child, we were not expecting you until Friday. Thomas, come here." A balding man emerged from the back room, and after hasty explanations and tearful embraces, Florence found herself in the small house behind the store, drinking strong coffee and explaining everything that had happened. Aunt Margaret's face grew grimmer as the story unfolded. "That Charles was always a peacock," she pronounced when Florence finished. "You are better off without him, and you are welcome to stay here as long as you need. We can always use help in the store." "I will earn my keep," Florence said firmly. "I will not be charity." "Would not dream of it," Uncle Thomas said, his eyes kind. "We have been needing someone to help with the books and wait on customers. Margaret's hands have been bothering her lately, the arthritis, you know. You would be doing us a favor." Florence felt the knot in her chest loosen slightly. She had a place to stay and work to do. It was more than she had expected. She started in the store the next morning, learning where everything was kept, how to measure flour and sugar, how to deal with customers who ranged from friendly townswomen to taciturn ranchers. The work was harder than anything she had done in Philadelphia, where servants had handled everything. Her back ached from lifting, her feet hurt from standing all day, and her hands grew rough from handling rope and tools. But she found she did not mind. There was a straightforwardness to it, a simple exchange of work for value that felt honest in a way Charles's world never had. She had been there a week when Garrett Zimmerman walked into the store. He stopped when he saw her behind the counter, that smile spreading across his face again. "Miss Ramsey, you found your aunt all right." "I did, thank you." Florence felt heat rise in her cheeks and told herself it was just the warmth from the stove. "What can I help you with?" "Need some rope, about 50 feet, and a box of nails, the 3-inch ones." He leaned against the counter, completely at ease. "How are you settling in?" "Well enough." She measured out the rope, trying to remember what Uncle Thomas had charged the last customer. "It is very different from Philadelphia." "I imagine so. You ever been out west before?" "No. This is all new to me." She found the nails and set them on the counter. "That will be $2.30. He counted out the coins and their fingers brushed as she took the money. The contact lasted only a second, but it sent a strange warmth up her arm. His eyes met hers, and she saw something there that made her breath catch. "If you ever want to see some of the country around here, I would be happy to show you," he said. "It is beautiful once you get away from town. Mountains, meadows, streams full of trout." Florence hesitated. Every sensible part of her said this was too fast, that she had just escaped one romantic disaster and should not be contemplating another. But Garrett's invitation seemed sincere, not calculated like Charles's courtship had been, and there was something about him that made her want to say yes. "That would be nice," she said finally. "When I have a day off. Sunday's work." "Yes." His smile widened. "I will come by after church then. Bring a good pair of boots if you have them." After he left, Aunt Margaret emerged from the back room with a knowing look. "That Garrett Zimmerman is a good man. Lost his parents to fever 5 years ago, has been running that ranch by himself ever since. Works harder than anyone I know, and honest as the day is long." "I am not looking for a husband, Aunt Margaret," Florence said firmly. "Did not say you were. Just making an observation." But her aunt's eyes twinkled with matchmaking schemes. Sunday came with clear skies and a cool breeze that smelled of pine. Florence wore her most practical dress and her sturdiest boots, which were still far too delicate for real ranch country. But they would have to do. Garrett arrived driving a buckboard pulled by 2 horses, and he helped her up to the seat with a hand that was calloused but careful. They drove south out of town, following a road that climbed into the mountains. Garrett pointed out landmarks, a peak where Apaches had once had a lookout, a meadow where the elk came in winter, a stream where he had caught his first trout as a boy. He talked easily, not trying to impress her, just sharing the land he clearly loved. Florence found herself relaxing, asking questions, laughing at his stories. They stopped in a high meadow carpeted with wildflowers, yellow, purple, white, and pink blooms that swayed in the breeze. Mountains surrounded them on all sides, their peaks still dusted with snow. Garrett spread a blanket and produced sandwiches, apples, and a jar of lemonade from a basket. "This is beautiful," Florence said, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "I have never seen anything like it." "It grows on you," Garrett said. "The West. At first it seems harsh and empty, but then you start to see the details. The way the light hits the rocks at sunset, the sound of the wind in the pines, the way the whole world smells after a rain." He paused. "I have been east a few times to Kansas City and Denver. Too crowded for me. Too many people trying to impress each other. Out here, you are what you do, not what your name is or how much money your daddy had." Florence sat down on the blanket, her throat suddenly tight. "That is a refreshing change. Your aunt told me a bit about what happened," Garrett said carefully. "With your father's business and your fiancé, I hope you do not mind. She was not gossiping, just explaining why you had come out here. It is all right. Everyone will know soon enough anyway." Florence picked a wildflower and twirled it between her fingers. "I was a fool. I thought Charles loved me, but he only loved what I represented. The money, the connections, the easy life. When that disappeared, so did he." "Then he was the fool," Garrett said quietly. "Any man who cannot see past money to the person underneath is not worth your time." She looked at him, at his honest face and steady eyes, and felt something shift inside her. "Why did you ask me out here today? You do not know anything about me." "I know enough," he said. "I know you traveled 2,000 miles by yourself to start over. I know you work hard in your uncle's store and do not complain. I know you have kind eyes and a pretty smile. And I know that when I met you at that way station, something inside me said, 'Pay attention. This one matters.'" He gave a self-deprecating shrug. "Maybe that makes me foolish, acting on feelings instead of sense. But I figure life is too short to ignore the things that matter." Florence felt tears prick her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. "I am not ready for promises or commitments, Garrett. I am still figuring out who I am without my father's name or my fiancé's plans for me." "I am not asking for promises," he said. "Just a chance to spend time with you, to show you this country and maybe make you smile. Whatever happens after that, we will figure it out as we go." She nodded, not trusting her voice. They ate their lunch and talked about safer things: his ranch, her aunt and uncle's store, the town's history, the rhythms of life in Arizona territory. As the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, casting everything in gold, Garrett helped her back into the buckboard and they drove toward town. The weeks that followed fell into a pattern. Florence worked in the store 6 days a week, learning the business and the people of Springerville. She discovered she had a knack for the bookkeeping, finding ways to organize the accounts that made more sense than Uncle Thomas's haphazard system. She also found she enjoyed talking to the customers, hearing their stories, becoming part of the community. On Sundays, Garrett came calling. Sometimes they drove out into the mountains. Sometimes they walked along the little Colorado River that ran near town. Sometimes they just sat on her aunt's porch and talked until the stars came out. Florence felt herself changing. The soft, sheltered girl who had left Philadelphia was being replaced by someone stronger, more capable. Her hands developed calluses from work. Her skin tanned despite her bonnet. She learned to laugh again, really laugh at Garrett's stories and the absurdities of frontier life. And she felt herself falling for the quiet cowboy who never tried to be anything other than exactly who he was. Garrett was patient in a way Charles had never been. He did not push or demand or assume. He asked questions and listened to her answers. He respected her need to stand on her own 2 feet. When she mentioned wanting to send money to settle one of her father's remaining debts, he did not offer to pay it for her. Instead, he helped her figure out how to save enough from her wages to manage it. When she talked about her fears of being hurt again, he did not dismiss them or promise the impossible. He just said, "I cannot control what other men did. I can only show you who I am and hope that is enough." By July, she knew she was in love with him. The realization came on a hot afternoon when he came into the store, dusty and tired from driving cattle, and his whole face lit up when he saw her. Her heart did something complicated in her chest, and she thought, this is what it is supposed to feel like. Not the performance she had shared with Charles, but this deep certainty that she wanted to see that smile every day for the rest of her life. But fear held her back from saying anything. What if she was wrong again? What if she had misread him the way she had misread Charles? What if his feelings changed when he knew her better? In August, a drought settled over the territory. The streams ran low, the grass turned brown, and tempers grew short. Garrett came into town less often, working from dawn to dusk to keep his cattle watered and fed. When he did come, he looked exhausted, his face drawn with worry. "How bad is it?" Florence asked one evening as they sat on the porch, the setting sun painting the sky orange and red. "Bad enough," he admitted. "I have already sold half my herd because I cannot feed them all. If we do not get rain soon, I will have to sell more." He rubbed his face. "I have been building that ranch for 5 years, trying to make it into something solid, something that could support a family. Now I am watching it dry up and blow away." Florence took his hand, feeling the roughness of his palm against hers. "You will rebuild. You are too stubborn to quit." He laughed, but it sounded bitter. "Stubbornness only gets you so far. There are bigger ranchers around here who would love to buy me out cheap, take my land and water rights. I might not have a choice." "There is always a choice," Florence said fiercely. "I learned that. When everything fell apart in Philadelphia, I had a choice. I could give up or I could start over. You taught me that the West is about what you do, not what you have. So do something. Fight for what is yours." He looked at her for a long moment, then squeezed her hand. "When did you get so wise?" "I learned from a cowboy I know." The rains came in September, hard and sudden, filling the streams and turning the brown land green again. Garrett's remaining cattle fattened, and he told Florence he thought he could hold on to the ranch after all. Relief and joy mingled in his smile, and she realized she had been almost as worried as he was, as if his struggles were her own. In October, the first snow dusted the mountain peaks, and the aspens turned gold. Florence had been in Springerville for 6 months, and she could barely remember the woman she had been in Philadelphia. That version of herself seemed like a stranger, naive, sheltered, focused on appearances instead of substance. She had built a real life here with work that mattered and people who cared about her, not her bank account. On a Sunday in late October, Garrett took her back to the meadow where they had picnicked on their first outing. The wildflowers were gone now, replaced by golden grass that rustled in the wind. They sat on the same blanket, drinking coffee from a thermos and watching clouds drift across the impossibly blue sky. "Florence," Garrett said, his voice more serious than usual, "I need to tell you something." Her stomach dropped. Here it comes, she thought. The revelation that he is moving away or marrying someone else, or realized he made a mistake. She braced herself. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been since the day I met you at that way station. Maybe that is crazy, falling for someone that fast, but it is the truth. You are the strongest, smartest, most beautiful woman I have ever met, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. "I know you said you were not ready for promises, and I know you have reasons to be careful, but I am asking anyway. Will you marry me?" Florence stared at the box, her heart racing. Every fear she had been carrying for months rose up. What if he left like Charles had? What if she was not enough? What if she was making another mistake? But then she looked at Garrett's face, at the hope and vulnerability in his eyes, and she knew. This was not Charles promising pretty words while calculating social advantages. This was a man who had watched her at her lowest, who had seen her scrubbing floors and keeping books and building a new life from nothing, and loved her not despite those things but because of them. "Yes," she said, and watched his face transform with joy. "Yes, I will marry you." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band with a small sapphire set in it. "It was my grandmother's," he said. "Not fancy like you are probably used to, but it is real." "It is perfect," Florence said, and meant it. He slipped it onto her finger and it fit as if it had been made for her. They were married in November in the small church in Springerville, with Aunt Margaret crying happy tears and Uncle Thomas beaming and what seemed like the entire town crowding into the pews. Florence wore a simple dress she had sewn herself, white with blue trim that matched her ring. Garrett wore his Sunday best, which was still just clean work clothes, but he looked more handsome than any man in a fancy suit. The pastor, an elderly man with a booming voice, pronounced them husband and wife, and when Garrett kissed her, Florence felt like she had finally come home. They moved into the ranch house 10 miles south of town, a sturdy building Garrett had built with his own hands. It was small, just 3 rooms and a loft, but it had glass windows and a good stove and a porch that looked out over the most beautiful view Florence had ever seen. She learned to cook on a wood stove, to tend chickens and a vegetable garden, to help with the ranch work when Garrett needed an extra pair of hands. Her hands grew rougher and her muscles stronger. She would catch sight of herself in the mirror sometimes and hardly recognize the sun-browned, capable woman staring back. But it was not all work. In the evenings, they sat on the porch and watched the sun set over the mountains. Garrett taught her to ride a horse properly, and they explored the canyons and mesas together. In winter, when snow made work impossible, they stayed inside by the fire, reading to each other or just talking. Florence discovered that marriage to the right person was nothing like she had imagined with Charles. There were no performances, no trying to be someone she was not. Garrett loved her messy hair and dusty dresses, loved her sharp mind and stubborn streak, loved all the parts of herself she had learned to value. In the spring, she realized she was pregnant. Garrett picked her up and spun her around when she told him, his laughter echoing across the ranch. They prepared through the summer, adding a cradle that Garrett carved from pine and blankets that Florence sewed. Aunt Margaret came out to the ranch as Florence's time grew near, clucking over her and making sure she rested. Their son was born on a warm September evening, exactly a year after the rains had saved the ranch. He came into the world squalling, a healthy boy with his father's gray eyes and dark hair. They named him Samuel, after Garrett's father. Florence held her son and looked at her husband and felt a completeness she had not known was possible. The years that followed were full of the ordinary joys and struggles of ranch life. The cattle herd grew. They added rooms to the house. Florence started keeping the books not just for their ranch but for several neighbors, earning extra money that helped during lean years. When Samuel was 2, a daughter arrived, whom they named Mary after Florence's mother. When Mary was 3, another son came, and they called him Thomas after Uncle Thomas, who had passed away the year before, leaving the general store to Aunt Margaret. Florence sometimes thought about her old life in Philadelphia, but it felt like something that had happened to someone else. She had been so focused on appearances, on maintaining a position in society that turned out to be as substantial as smoke. Out here, what mattered was water and grass, and whether your word was good. She had more real friends among the ranchers' wives and townspeople of Springerville than she had ever had in Philadelphia's parlors. Sometimes she wondered what had become of Charles. She heard through Aunt Margaret, who still corresponded with old friends back east, that he had married an heiress from New York. Florence felt nothing when she heard the news, not even satisfaction. Charles belonged to a different world, one she had left behind without regret. One evening in their 10th year of marriage, Florence and Garrett sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard. Samuel, now 9, was teaching Mary and Thomas how to rope a fence post. The sun was setting, painting everything gold and orange, and a cool breeze carried the smell of pine from the mountains. "Do you ever regret it?" Garrett asked. "Giving up the city life for this?" Florence looked at her husband, at the silver just starting to show in his dark hair, at the laugh lines around his eyes that had deepened over the years. She looked at their children, healthy and happy, running through the dust without a care. She looked at the house they had built together, the land they had worked, the life they had created from nothing but determination and love. "Not for a single second," she said. "Everything I lost brought me here to you, to this. I did not lose anything that mattered. I found everything that does." Garrett took her hand, his rough palm warm against hers, and they sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank below the mountains. Inside, Florence knew dinner was waiting, and after that there would be bedtime stories for the children and then quiet hours with her husband. Tomorrow would bring work, cattle to tend, accounts to balance, a life to maintain. But it was her life, built on her own terms with a man who loved her not for what she had but for who she was. The girl who had arrived in Springerville with 2 trunks and a broken heart seemed impossibly distant now. Florence had discovered that losing everything could be the greatest gift because it showed you what truly mattered. Money could vanish, social standing could crumble, fiancés could leave. But love, real love, built on respect and partnership and seeing each other clearly, that lasted. That was the fortune worth having. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Samuel called out that he had successfully roped the post. His siblings cheered, and Garrett called back encouragement. Florence smiled, watching her family, and thought about how strange life was. She had come west running from loss, expecting only to survive. Instead, she had found everything she had been searching for without knowing it. She had found a home not in a place, but in the quiet cowboy who had loved her when she had nothing, who had seen value in her when she had doubted her own worth, who had built a life with her that was richer than any fortune. The wind picked up, carrying the coolness of coming autumn, and Florence pulled her shawl tighter. Garrett noticed and moved closer, putting his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him, solid and warm and constant, and felt a wave of gratitude so intense it almost hurt. For this man, for this life, for the lessons she had learned about what truly mattered. "I love you," she said, the words simple but carrying the weight of everything they had built together. "I love you too," Garrett replied and kissed the top of her head. Their children's laughter rang across the ranch as darkness fell and the stars emerged, countless and bright above the Arizona mountains. Inside the house, lamps would soon be lit, dinner would be served, and another day would end in the rhythm that defined their life. Florence Zimmerman, formerly Ramsey of Philadelphia, sat on her porch with her husband's arm around her and her children playing nearby, and knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The woman who had lost her fortune and her fiancé had gained something infinitely more valuable: a love that did not count the cost, a partner who valued her heart over her bank account, and a life built on the solid foundation of work, honesty, and devotion. As they finally called the children inside for dinner, Florence took one last look at the mountains silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and joys, but tonight she had everything that mattered. She had learned the hard way that true wealth was not measured in dollars or social standing, but in the strength of the bonds you built and the love you shared. And by that measure, Florence Zimmerman was the richest woman in Arizona territory. The years continued to roll by like the seasons, each bringing its own character to their life on the ranch. By the time Samuel was 15, he was working alongside his father from dawn to dusk, learning the craft of ranching with the same quiet determination Garrett had shown. Mary, at 13, had her mother's head for numbers and kept immaculate records of the ranch's breeding lines and sales. Young Thomas, 11 now, had a gift with horses that astonished everyone who saw him work. The ranch had grown prosperous through careful management and hard work. Garrett's reputation for honest dealing meant he got good prices for his cattle. Florence's bookkeeping and business sense had helped them avoid the pitfalls that sank other ranchers. They had weathered droughts and harsh winters, disease and market fluctuations, always coming through because they worked as a team and never spent beyond their means. Springerville had grown too. The railroad had extended a branch line closer to town, bringing more settlers and businesses. Aunt Margaret had passed away peacefully in her sleep at 73, leaving the general store to Florence. They had hired a manager to run it, but Florence still kept the books and made decisions about inventory. The income from the store supplemented the ranch during lean years and provided security for their children's future. One afternoon in early summer, a stranger rode up to the ranch. He was well dressed in Eastern clothes that looked out of place in the desert dust, riding a horse that had clearly been rented in town. Garrett was in the north pasture, so Florence walked out to greet him, wiping her hands on her apron. She had been making bread, and flour dusted her arms. "Can I help you?" she asked. The man removed his hat, revealing graying hair and a face that tugged at her memory. "I am looking for Florence Ramsey. I was told she might be here." "I am Florence Zimmerman now," she said, a strange feeling settling in her stomach. "Who are you?" "My name is Robert Harrison. I was your father's lawyer in Philadelphia." He looked uncomfortable. "May I speak with you for a few minutes?" Florence led him to the porch and offered water, which he accepted gratefully. Up close, she could see he was older than she had first thought, probably in his 60s, with the pallor of someone who spent too much time indoors. "Mrs. Zimmerman," he began, "I have been trying to locate you for nearly 2 years. You are very difficult to find." "I did not think anyone was looking," Florence said carefully. "There has been a development regarding your father's estate." Harrison pulled papers from his satchel. "You are aware that his shipping business failed and his assets were sold to satisfy creditors." "I am aware. I was there." "Yes, well, what you do not know is that one of his vessels, the Caroline Marie, did not actually sink in that storm. It was damaged and limped into a port in the Caribbean, where it underwent repairs." The captain was unable to communicate with the Home Office because the Philadelphia operation had already collapsed and the offices were closed. He sold the cargo at port, made his repairs, and sailed to New York to find out what had happened. That was 18 months ago. Florence's heart began to beat faster. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that your father had insured that vessel and its cargo separately through a different company than the other ships. When the Caroline Marie was confirmed lost, that insurance company paid out the claim. But the ship was not lost. The insurance company tried to recover their payout from your father's estate, but there was nothing left to recover. However, the ship itself still existed, along with the profits from its cargo sale. After extensive legal proceedings, it has been determined that those assets belong to your father's heir. You, Mrs. Zimmerman." He handed her a bank draft. Florence looked at the number written on it and had to read it 3 times to believe it. $50,000. "This is not all of it," Harrison continued. "The ship itself was sold, and after all legal fees and outstanding debts were satisfied, this is your portion. You are not wealthy by Philadelphia standards, but you are certainly comfortable." Florence stared at the paper in her hands. $50,000. More money than she and Garrett would make from the ranch in 10 years of hard work. Enough to expand the ranch, to send all 3 children to university back east, to live in comfort for the rest of their lives. "There is one other thing," Harrison said. "I ran into Charles Pemberton in Philadelphia before I left. He had heard I was searching for you. He asked me to deliver a letter." He handed her an envelope. Florence recognized Charles's handwriting on the front. For a moment, she considered throwing it away unread, but curiosity won. She opened it and skimmed the contents. It was exactly what she expected. Charles had heard about her inheritance. His marriage was unhappy. He had made a terrible mistake. Would she consider giving him another chance? Florence laughed, a sound of genuine amusement that made Harrison look startled. She walked to the stove, opened it, and tossed the letter into the flames. "You will not be replying?" Harrison asked. "That is my reply," Florence said. "Mr. Harrison, I am grateful that you found me and delivered this news, but that money does not change anything. I have a life here, a good life, with a husband I love and children I adore. Charles Pemberton belongs to a past I have no interest in revisiting." Harrison looked around at the ranch house, simple but well built, at the mountains beyond, at Florence in her flower-dusted dress and sun-browned face. "You are happy here." "I am happier than I ever was in Philadelphia," Florence said honestly. "Thank you for making the journey. Will you stay for dinner? My husband will be back soon, and we would be glad of the company." Harrison did stay, and over pot roast and vegetables from Florence's garden, she and Garrett discussed what to do with the unexpected windfall. The conversation was easy, full of questions and ideas. They could expand the ranch, or invest in the store, or put money aside for the children's education. But there was no tension, no arguing, just 2 partners figuring out how to handle an opportunity together. After Harrison left the next morning to return to Philadelphia, Florence and Garrett sat on their porch with coffee and watched the sun rise over the mountains. $50,000, Garrett said, shaking his head. "That is a fortune." "It is," Florence agreed, "but it is not what matters." "No," she took his hand. "When Charles left me, I thought my life was over. I thought my value was in my father's money and social position. Coming here, meeting you, building this life, taught me that I was wrong. My value is in who I am, what I do, the love I give and receive. This money is nice and we will use it wisely, but it does not change anything that matters." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "You know what I think we should do with some of it?" "What?" "There are a lot of young people in this territory trying to start ranches or businesses, but they cannot get loans from the banks back east. What if we set up a fund to help them? Not charity, but fair loans at reasonable terms. Give them the kind of chance we built for ourselves." Florence smiled. This was why she loved him. His first thought was not how the money could benefit them, but how it could help others. "I think that is a perfect idea." They did establish the fund, and over the years it helped dozens of young families get their start. Some repaid their loans and prospered. Some failed and could not repay, and Florence and Garrett forgave those debts without rancor. The fund became one of their proudest legacies. They used some of the money to expand the ranch and upgrade their house, adding a proper parlor and bedrooms for each of the children. They set aside funds for education, and when the time came, all 3 children went to university. Samuel studied animal husbandry and returned to help run the ranch with modern scientific methods. Mary became a teacher and opened a school in Springerville. Thomas studied veterinary medicine and became the first qualified veterinarian in that part of Arizona Territory. Florence and Garrett also traveled, something they had never had the luxury to do before. They visited San Francisco, Denver, and even made one trip back to Philadelphia. Florence walked past her old family home, now occupied by strangers, and felt nothing but mild curiosity. That life was so completely behind her that it held no power anymore. They aged together, gray creeping into both their hair, their bodies showing the wear of hard work and good living. But they aged happy, surrounded by children and eventually grandchildren. The ranch remained prosperous, a testament to their joint work. The store in Springerville thrived under good management. The loan fund helped countless families. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a celebration. A long table was set up in the yard, laden with food and drink. Neighbors and friends came from miles around. As the sun began to set, Samuel stood and raised his glass. "To my parents," he said, "who taught us that wealth is not measured in dollars but in the strength of your character and the depth of your love. Happy anniversary." Everyone drank, and Florence felt tears prick her eyes. She looked around at the faces she loved, at the land she had worked, at the life she had built from the ashes of her old one. Garrett squeezed her hand under the table, and she squeezed back, a silent conversation of love and gratitude. Later, when the guests had gone and the children were cleaning up, Florence and Garrett walked up to the meadow where he had proposed all those years ago. It took longer now, their legs not as strong as they once were, but they made it. They sat on a blanket under the stars, just like that first picnic. "You remember what you said to me that day?" Garrett asked. "When I told you I loved you." "I said I was not ready for promises," Florence replied. "I was so scared of being hurt again. And now I know the difference between a man who makes promises because they sound good and a man who makes promises because he means them." She leaned against his shoulder. "You have kept every promise you ever made to me, Garrett Zimmerman, every single one. You made it easy," he said. "Loving you has been the simplest, most natural thing I have ever done." They sat in silence, listening to the wind in the pines and the distant call of a night bird. Florence thought about the girl she had been at 23, standing in a Philadelphia parlor with a telegram that shattered her world. If she could go back and tell that girl what was coming, the pain and loss and fear, but also the joy and love and fulfillment, would she do anything differently? No, she decided. Every moment, good and bad, had led her here, had shaped her into the woman she had become, had brought her to this man and this life. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what? For loving me when I had nothing. For seeing value in me when I did not see it in myself. For building this life with me." She turned to look at him in the starlight. "For everything. Garrett pulled her close and kissed her forehead. "Thank you for saying yes, for taking a chance on a cowboy with more dreams than sense, for making this ranch a home, for giving me a family and a life beyond anything I imagined." They made their way back down to the house as the moon rose, walking slowly, Garrett's arm around Florence's waist. Inside, lamplight glowed warm and welcoming. Their children had left everything clean, and a note saying they would be back for Sunday dinner. Florence changed into her nightgown and brushed out her long hair, now more silver than brown. In the mirror, she saw a face marked by years, and whether by laughter and occasional tears, by a life fully lived. She saw a woman who had lost everything and gained everything, who had learned that true wealth had nothing to do with bank accounts. She climbed into bed beside her husband, and he put his arm around her like he had every night for 25 years. This, Florence thought as she drifted toward sleep, this was what mattered. Not the fortune she had inherited or lost or regained, but this simple moment of warmth and safety and love. This was the treasure worth keeping, the wealth that would never depreciate or disappear. Outside, the Arizona night stretched vast and star-filled over the ranch. Cattle lowed in distant pastures. The wind sighed through the pines. And in the small house on the hill, Florence and Garrett Zimmerman slept peacefully, surrounded by everything they had built together, rich beyond measure in all the ways that truly counted. The years rolled on toward the new century, bringing change to Arizona territory. Statehood seemed increasingly likely. Towns grew larger, connected by railroad and telegraph. The wild days of the frontier were fading into memory, replaced by something more settled and civilized. But the essential character of the place remained. A land where what you did mattered more than who you were born to be. Florence and Garrett watched these changes from their porch, content to let the world transform around them while their own world remained steady. They were in their 60s now, grandparents many times over, respected elders of the community. Garrett had handed over the daily running of the ranch to Samuel, though he still consulted on major decisions. Florence had retired from active management of the store, but still reviewed the books quarterly. They had earned their rest. One evening, as they sat watching another spectacular sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Garrett said, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if that telegram had never come? If your father's business had not failed?" Florence considered the question. "I would have married Charles, I suppose. Lived in Philadelphia, hosted parties, raised children who went to the right schools and married the right people. Been respectable and comfortable and completely unfulfilled. No regrets then, not a single one." She took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture as familiar as breathing. "Everything I lost brought me here, to you, to our children, to this life. How could I regret that?" Garrett raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I am a lucky man." "We are both lucky," Florence corrected. "We found each other when we needed to most." As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, they went inside to the house that had sheltered their love for decades. The walls held photographs now, their children at various ages, their grandchildren laughing, the ranch through the seasons. Each image told a story, captured a moment in the rich tapestry of their shared life. Florence prepared tea while Garrett stoked the fire against the cool evening air. They moved around each other with the easy choreography of long partnership, anticipating needs, making space, working together without needing words. This, too, was love. Not just the grand gestures and passionate declarations, but the daily dance of partnership, the small kindnesses, the comfort of presence. They sat together in their favorite chairs, close enough to hold hands, and talked about their day, their grandchildren's antics, their plans for tomorrow. Simple conversation, but filled with the warmth of deep affection and mutual respect. Eventually, Florence picked up her mending and Garrett opened a book, and they sat in companionable silence broken only by the crackle of the fire. This was the life Florence had found when she lost everything. This quiet joy, this deep contentment, this abiding love. She had learned that the things the world valued, money, status, appearances, were ultimately hollow. What mattered was character, partnership, the life you built with your own hands and the love you nurtured through good times and bad. When they finally went to bed, the moon was high and bright, casting silver light through their window. Garrett fell asleep quickly, his breathing deep and even. Florence lay awake a little longer, thinking about the long road that had brought her here. The girl who had stepped off the stage in Springerville with 2 trunks and a broken heart would hardly recognize the woman she had become. But Florence recognized her, saw her in every choice that had led to this moment. She thought about Charles sometimes, but only with distant curiosity. She had heard he died a few years ago, his wife remarrying within 6 months. Their life together had apparently been as hollow as Florence had suspected it would be. She felt no satisfaction in this, only a mild sadness that he had never found what she had: real love, genuine partnership, a life of meaning. But mostly she thought about Garrett, about the moment he had steadied her elbow at that way station and smiled at her with gray eyes full of kindness. About the patient way he had courted her, giving her space to heal while showing her who he was. About the years they had worked side by side, building something real and lasting. About the love that had only deepened with time, weathering every storm, growing stronger through every challenge. This was the fortune that mattered, Florence thought as she drifted towards sleep. Not the money her father had made and lost, and that she had eventually regained, but this. The man sleeping beside her, the children and grandchildren who bore their combined legacy. The ranch and community they had helped build. The lives they had touched through kindness and fair dealing. She had learned the hardest lesson, that losing everything could be the greatest gift because it showed you what truly had value. Her fiancé had left when she lost her money, but the cowboy had loved her when she had nothing, and in doing so had given her everything that mattered. Florence Zimmerman closed her eyes, her hand resting on her husband's shoulder, and fell asleep with a smile on her face, rich beyond measure in all the ways that counted, grateful for every moment of the beautiful life they had built together.